It's 2017, and you just finished watching Spider-Man Homecoming in theaters. You talk with your friends about the fresh take on the wall crawler, and you wait patiently as the credits roll for that precious post-credit scene, when suddenly, Captain America appears in full getup and tells you to have patience? Yes, in the last few years, the MCU very much popularized the idea of encouraging filmgoers to stick around once the credits start rolling, not just to appreciate all the talent that went into making the film, which should be noted, but with the promise that there will be some sort of small tease at the very end. While the films of the MCU may be amongst the most notable current examples, plenty of movies before and since have capitalized on the art of the post-credits scene. That's why we'll be talking about 10 movies with post-credit scenes that made the movie even better. Let's begin with the one that started it all. Back in 2008, no one could have fathomed the idea what Marvel Studios would eventually become. By the end of Iron Man, Phil Coulson revealed the shortened name of his organization, S.H.I.E.L.D., to Pepper Potts, and for comic fans at the time, we wondered if that could possibly be a reference to Nick Fury and the Avengers. But for those lucky few who stayed through the credits, of course we saw none other than Samuel L. Jackson in the full embodiment of the Ultimate Comics version of the character, who tells Tony that he's just entering a bigger world, and of course name-dropping the Avengers Initiative. It goes without saying that this may be one of the most important post-credit scenes of all time, as who would have thought that 13 years later we'd be 23 films in, with over 20 or so projects on the way, and no end in sight for this modern-day myth. Okay, this whole video won't strictly cover MCU movies, I promise, but we couldn't not mention this one. By the time the Avengers came out, it was the third highest grossing film of all time, and basically universally praised across the board. Marvel had successfully made an interconnected universe of films, with one of the most satisfying payoffs ever. But where could it go from here? This post-credit scene came completely out of left field. No one saw this coming. I mean, there were no hints of it up until that point. But yes, when we saw that space throne and the sinister purple-faced grin, it immediately made fans go crazy. The idea of Thanos becoming the next big bad immediately led to speculation that they would turn to the Infinity Gauntlet storyline, one of the biggest crossover events in comics. It was this post-credit scene which perfectly acted as a stepping stone from one huge movie into an even bigger storyline that would be told across the next 7 years and culminated in what is now the biggest movie of all time. A movie that took animation to the next level, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is arguably one of, if not the best, Spider-Man film we've gotten thus far. As if the movie even needed anything to elevate it further, it also has one of the most unexpected but hilarious post-credits scenes in recent years. After the events of the film, we see Spider-Man 2099, voiced by none other than Oscar Isaac, who seems to have observed the events of the film from his futuristic HQ. He uses a device referred to as a goober to make a multi-space jump from his timeline to the classic 1967 cartoon series animation and all. He appears in the famously meme scene of Spider-Man encountering an imposter, where the two continually point at each other while antagonizing each other for said pointing. Even an officer and J. Jonah Jameson debate on who started pointing first. What makes this scene so hilarious is that they took the actual cartoon footage from the original scene and simply dubbed over it. The only obvious change is the inclusion of 2099's suit. While it may not lead to anything in the future, it was definitely an unexpected treat for everyone who stuck around after the credits. Most post-credit scenes tease an upcoming sequel, but how many can you say teased all the sequels? You think I'm exaggerating, but nope. We're talking about 22 Jump Street. The Jump Street series is a hilariously clever commentary on the buddy cop genre and action films in general. Only Phil Lord and Chris Miller could have conjured up a movie that's so on the edge of meta without straight up breaking the fourth wall. The post-credit scene of the second film is perhaps the best ever parody trilogy of tiresome blockbuster franchises as we get to see far into the future of Jenko and Schmidt's adventures, encompassing literally dozens of sequels, some of which included a retirement home, an animated series, and a video game. I personally want to see the Sunday School sequel with Seth Rogen the most. The funniest part is, while it's clearly supposed to be an exaggeration, I'm pretty sure there's still less installments listed in this sequence than the entire MCU so far. When Principal Ed Rooney hilariously fails to catch Ferris Bueller in the act of playing hooky, we get the pleasure of following him home during the entire end credits of the movie. As if this wasn't amusing enough, when it cuts to black, we suddenly see Ferris appear in a bathrobe. He's surprised that the audience is still there and proceeds to tell us to go home. Ferris Bueller is one of the earlier examples of breaking the fourth wall, as he'd regularly acknowledge the audience throughout the movie, something which wasn't considered a regular occurrence at the time. Having Ferris address the audience one last time really tied the whole film together, and in a way that made it extra meta, and wouldn't be surpassed until the fourth wall would later be obliterated by Wade Wilson, who literally remade that exact scene. There's few things more inspirational than a biopic on someone's success story. There's even fewer things more inspirational than the success story of Tommy Wiseau. Apologies, the great Tommy Wiseau. But in all seriousness, The Disaster Artist was a surprisingly touching story following the previously aforementioned auteur of The Room, a film which is truly one of a kind. Take that as you will. In a truly unexpected post-credits scene for the biopic, we see a cameo from Tommy Wiseau himself, who meets the James Franco version of him at a party, where they have a brief meeting of the minds. First of all, Wiseau is such a larger-than-life presence that it would have been a missed opportunity to not have him appear in the film, so that in itself really ends the movie on a high note. But perhaps the biggest takeaway from this scene is how surprisingly well Wiseau acts against Franco, who also happens to be imitating him. The whole situation is just hilariously surreal. Speaking of James Franco and surreal situations, the 2011 reboot of the Planet of the Apes franchise is the first installment in what would go on to be an amazing trilogy. The film acts as a sort of an early prequel to the original films, showing the downfall of mankind and the uprising of the apes begin. In the post-credits scene, we see how a character exposed to the simian flu is revealed to work on an airline, whose flight would go on to spread the virus around the world, starting the pandemic, which would change life as they knew it. Good thing this is totally fictional, right? Who would have thought the fifth installment in a series about cars would be the one to reinvigorate it? Almost everything suggested that Fast 5 wouldn't be a good movie going in. But against all odds, it was a huge success and even has a case as the best in the franchise. Like all great blockbusters, it left us on a huge cliffhanger in the post-credits, revealing that Letty survived the events of the previous film. This would prove to be a huge deal, as it would kick off the events of the subsequent movies, all of which would be crazy box office hits. Whether or not you're still in love with the franchise at this point, which many would agree peaked at the seventh film, you can't deny that it's a huge feat to have lasted this long and still had people invested. Arguably the epitome Jack Black movie, and my favorite Richard Linklater movie, School of Rock is a classic that deserves everyone's respect. In peak Jack Black form, he gives off that infectious energy and charisma that literally doesn't let up until the film stops. The final scene shows him starting his own music school in his apartment, where he jams out to AC/DC with the class as the credits seamlessly start to roll. We get to see all the students continuously play, get their own solos, and even get meta as they acknowledge the credits and the ending of the film. While it isn't much of a post-credit scene as it is a during-credit scene, I dare anyone to watch this film and turn it off without watching the whole thing. It's just that good. Remember when this movie came out? Even if you didn't see it, you literally couldn't go anywhere without people talking about it. And rightfully so, because The Hangover was, and still is, so good. Throughout the film, the events of the previous night are a complete mystery, and we're only left with the consequences. Up until the ending, the mythical events of that bachelor party are mainly left up to the imagination, until the group finds a camera that has photographic documentation of everything. Many would argue that this is one of the, if not the best, end credit sequence of all time, as it perfectly ties up the movie in hilarious fashion, revealing all the photos on screen with an almost narrative progression to them. They're also so crazy that they completely live up to the events of the entire film. There are honestly too many great post-credit scenes to count. I mean, we could have made this strictly a Marvel-centric video, and we still wouldn't have been able to cover just those movies. Like, I could have mentioned how Far From Home has some of the biggest revelations in the MCU so far, but to avoid talking about Marvel too much, I figured I'd leave it out. Oh, wait.